Julia is one of my favorite characters in the original Cowboy Bebop. The new Netflix adaptation does not seem to understand what makes her character work, and the adaptation, in seeking, apparently, to try and make her a better character, in fact does the exact opposite, and weakens her character and turns her into an insulting parody of the Julia of the original show. The new show turns her into a villain who betrays Spike for the sake of cheap drama. Over the course of this video, I'm going to try to explain why I think the show did this, what they were going for, and, as importantly, why it didn't work. But before we get into what the new show does wrong, we have to consider what the old show did right. That Julia is one of my favorite characters in the original Cowboy Bebop might at first seem a little strange, considering that she's not much of a character at all, seemingly, at least not at first. She's much more of a shadow haunting Spike's psyche. We don't see a lot of her until the very end of the show. The shadow of Julia infects Spike's dreams and causes him to be paralyzed by his lingering love and affection for her. He can't move past that love. It's an emotional and psychological blockage for him. Outwardly cheerful, Spike is nonetheless inwardly sullen and lonely. He yearns for the days of his old relationship with Julia, and he hopes that flame can be rekindled in the future. Now, there is an absurdity to all of this. Spike and Julia were not exactly a perfect couple, and they weren't exactly happy while they were together. That relationship had a lot of problems that the show does not ignore, even if Spike would like to. They were in dangerous situations, and they were not exactly helping each other become better people. They were locked together in a climate of violence and gangsterism, and their relationship in the past, from what we see of it, was that of compulsion and passion that goes over the top and causes people to make some foolish decisions. The relationship wasn't vile or cruel, and I hate terms like toxic that are used so often to just group together a lot of different kinds of relationships, ranging from the mildly unhealthy but understandable to the completely abhorrent. And those are different kinds of experiences. Spike and Julia were just flawed people who hurt each other. Spike's idealization of this time in his life is not something that we, the audience, should join him in, but it is nonetheless understandable, considering how much he lives in the past, and he does not really seem to have anything to look forward to in the future. All his hopes, all his past optimism, all his desires and yearnings, none of that is geared toward the future or even the present. Even as time continuously pushes him and everyone else forward, his back is turned to the progression of time, and he's looking back at how his life used to be through a mildly idealized lens. Now, that is not to say Spike wallows in self-pity. He doesn't, and he doesn't engage in performative nihilism. He's honestly no different from a lot of other crew members on the Bebop, who are all trying to reach out and be there for each other, and they do enjoy each other's company, but they cannot truly open up to each other because they're too consumed by their pasts. They're so focused on what was, on the broken and shattered dreams of the people they used to be, and their desperate desires to recover those dreams, even though doing so is impossible. And the show understands this. Julia also understands this. Spike and the rest of the Bebop crew share their successes and failures, and to a certain extent, this little found family they form is quite beautiful. But it's not enough for them. They're not satisfied with it. They're all seeking a wholeness, a clarity, a sense of order that they believe can only be gained if they manage to go back and reassemble the broken pieces of the people they used to be. But that's not really possible. The actual Julia, as opposed to the Julia that exists in Spike's mind, is not going to be his healer. This isn't because she's a cruel person or some sort of femme fatale. She's not. She's a person who can play different roles depending on what the circumstances require of her. She can be this badass who does some morally questionable things. She has that darkness in her, and we do know that she was wrapped up in the Red Dragon Syndicate. She's not some sort of ingenue. But she's also not a cruel person, or even just a misguided person. She's just a person, a broken, lonely person in a broken, lonely universe. Even think about the traditional definition of the femme fatale, who is not necessarily a villain or an antagonist. She often is, and she often seeks to seduce and undermine the hero. But what a femme fatale is for me is, in a broad sense, just a character who kind of leads the hero to his doom, whether intentionally or not. The hero becomes so obsessed with finding love with this mysterious woman he falls for that he ends up abandoning all sense of practicality and all sense of what the circumstances actually are and just charging ahead to his doom. But to the extent that Spike is self-destructive in his chase after Julia, Julia is not to blame for this in the slightest. She doesn't plant that seed in him. She doesn't encourage it necessarily. She's much more clear-eyed about their relationship, both what it really was in the past and the limited possibilities for it in the future than Spike is. Again, I don't make this comparison to undermine Spike, who is one of my all-time favorite anime protagonists. I just say this to demonstrate who the Julia in the original show actually is. She is not cold-hearted, but also not naive. She's clear-eyed, mature, a little bit cynical, but not to the point of nihilism or idealizing the past. Netflix's Julia is not nearly that nuanced of a character. The show obviously wants to try to expand her character to spend more time with her, and this is not innately a bad decision. Now, I personally think that there is some value in spending so much time in the first half of the show on how Spike thinks about Julia, and the influence her shadow still has over his life, just so we can contrast that and compare it with the real Julia when she pops up. But expanding Julia's character from the get-go isn't a bad idea. There's a lot the show could have done with her, kind of establishing her as this charming but also flawed and fallible person who is not necessarily compatible with the ideal Spike has of her. But the show does not do this. Instead, it wraps Julia into the inane Vicious subplot. Vicious is also a character who is not served particularly well by this adaptation, as I explain in my video on Vicious. Vicious was never my favorite character in the original, but he had a sort of menace and a sort of primordial elemental ability to strike fear into the hearts of others and really embody their worst fears, especially in the case of Spike, that the new Vicious just doesn't have. He over-explains everything, and the show is so dedicated to making him into a more dimensional character that fails and instead just makes him rather tedious because it doesn't know what to do with his character. And the expansion of the vicious character kind of drags down Julia with him. I don't think anyone thinks the most important part of Julia's life is her relationship with Vicious. Yet that is something the new show is very ardently and passionately concerned about. It views Julia primarily through how she functions in this love triangle between her, Spike, and Vicious. Now, from a feminist perspective, you could say this is a little insulting, kind of reducing Julia to this figure in a love triangle is kind of cliche and demeaning, but also from an artistic perspective, it's just bland. It's just a nerd. It's just the most uninspired choice they could have made. In interviews, the showrunner talks about how this new version of Julia is different, saying that she has more agency and more subjectivity than the Julia in the original, but I think the exact opposite is true. The old Julia had her life, she had her own anxieties and her own struggles with getting away from her past and trying to forge her own life herself. Even though we don't see her doing all this, it is very much implied when we do see her. The new version of Julia is much more of a paper-thin character. She seems to exist only to create a lot of contrived drama that the show could have done without, and that's kind of a shame. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more videos like this. I'm not entirely sure I did need to do another video on the Netflix Cowboy Bebop, but the show's treatment of Julia really stuck with me and I wanted to talk a little more about it. I don't think the new Cowboy Bebop is as horrible as some Netflix adaptations of animated shows, but there's just no reason to watch it when you could just watch the original instead. It offers nothing new and nothing interesting, and certainly nothing better than the original. Anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.